When people hear the word dopamine, they often think of it as the pleasure chemical. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. In fact, the real function of dopamine is far more profound and impactful. It doesn't simply create a sense of euphoria when you experience something enjoyable. It plays a foundational role in motivation, drive, and goal-directed behavior. Dopamine is a neuromodulator, not just a neurotransmitter. That distinction is important. Neurotransmitters lights up like glutamate or GABA transmits signals between neurons. Neuromodulators like dopamine influence how neurons communicate up. They don't just carry messages from point A to point B, they change how entire circuits operate, often over longer periods of time, up. This is what allows dopamine to exert such widespread control over attention, effort, and energy. Inside the brain up, dopamine is primarily produced in a structure called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. From there, it travels along specific pathways, the most well-known being the mesoleic and mesocortical pathways. These pathways project to areas like nucleus accumbens. The prefrontal cortex lights up and other key regions involved in emotion, cognition, and decision-making. But here's the key: dopamine is released in anticipation of rewards, not just in response to them. When you're pursuing a goal, whether it's training for a marathon up, studying for an exam, or working toward a promotion, dopamine levels increase before you achieve the outcome. This anticipatory release creates energy, focus up, and a forward-leaning posture in your mental and physical systems. It makes you more likely to take action. In this sense, dopamine is much more about motivation than it is about reward. Think about it in evolutionary terms. For early humans, food wasn't guaranteed. Lights up. You had to go out and forage, hunt, or explore. That process required energy and effort. Dopamine was the neurochemical that prepared the brain and body to go out and engage with the environment, to take risks, seek out resources, lights up, and overcome challenges. It wasn't the food itself that triggered the biggest dopamine surge. It was the sight of a tree with fruit hanging from it up, or the sound of a stream nearby that might offer fish. Dopamine told the brain actually lights up. This is worth pursuing. What's interesting is that dopamine doesn't act alone up. It interacts with other systems, particularly the ones that regulate motor behavior. There's a close relationship between dopamine and movement. Up. The parts of the brain that control voluntary motion, such as the basal ganglia, are deeply influenced by dopamine levels. Lights up. This is why diseases characterized by dopamine depletion, like Parkinson's disease, lead to severe motor impairments. Up. It's not just that these individuals can't move well, it's that the motivational circuitry that drives movement is fundamentally disrupted. Up. In healthy individuals, this same principle applies in a more subtle way. When dopamine levels are elevated, people tend to move more, speak more up, and engage more readily with challenges. When dopamine is low, even simple tasks can feel overwhelming. Up. That's because dopamine doesn't just energize the body, it energizes the will. Now, up. There's a common misconception that dopamine equals feeling good. But high dopamine doesn't necessarily mean you're happy. It means you're motivated up. It means you're focused on a target and primed to take action. Lights up. That's why dopamine levels can be high even during stressful or difficult periods. If those moments are linked to meaningful pursuits or long-term goals, up, consider what happens when someone sets a challenging goal. The initial spark of motivation comes from a dopamine surge. They feel excited, capable, up, ready to start. Over time, as they keep moving toward that goal, their brain continues to release dopamine in response to each small step forward. Lights up. That reinforcement builds a loop. Action leads to progress. Progress leads to dopamine. Dopamine leads to more action. This cycle is what keeps us engaged. Without it, the brain has no reason to pursue anything. Without dopamine, life feels flat, not because nothing pleasurable is happening, but because the systems that drive seeking, striving, and learning are offline. Lights up. To understand how dopamine drives motivation, it's critical to look at two dimensions: baseline levels and phasic spikes. It actually lights up. These two components, the steady state and the rapid surges, work together to create the internal state we interpret as motivation. Ambition, it actually lights up, and willingness to pursue goals. Let's break them down. Baseline dopamine refers to the general lights up, ongoing level of dopamine activity in the brain when you're not experiencing anything particularly stimulating. This baseline is not static up. It varies from person to based on genetics, environment, stress, nutrition, sleep, and habitual behavior. It also fluctuates across time. Up. The higher your baseline dopamine, the more driven and engaged you tend to feel across the board. Things appear more interesting. Up. You're more inclined to take action. Conversely, when baseline dopamine is low, even simple tasks can feel unrewarding or effortful. You're actually lights up, your motivation to energy decreases, and your ability to focus is compromised. Then a dopamine spikes, also known as physic releases up. These occur in response to specific stimuli like achieving a goal, receiving praise, eating food, scrolling social media, or even anticipating a reward. Up spikes are short-lived but intense bursts of dopamine activity. These surges give you that feeling of excitement, novelty, and craving up. They reinforce the idea that something is important or valuable. And crucially, they train your brain to remember and seek that thing again in the future. Now, up the key is, this dopamine is a relative signal up. The brain doesn't just track how much dopamine is present, it tracks how much dopamine is released relative to your baseline. Lights up. That means a dopamine spike feels rewarding only if it rises significantly above your current baseline. Up. This is why the same activity can feel exciting one day and dull the next. If your baseline is shifted, the perceived impact of a dopamine spike changes up. This relative mechanism explains a lot about motivation. For example, people who chronically overstimulate their dopamine system through constant novelty lights up, social media, junk food, or even recreational drugs experience temporary spikes that over time cause their baseline to drop up. This process is called dopamine downregulation or adaptation. When the brain is exposed to frequent high dopamine surges, it tries to compensate by reducing receptor sensitivity or overall dopamine availability. The result, a lower baseline. And when the baseline is lower, normal life begins to feel less interesting, less exciting, and far more effortful. On the other hand, actually lights up. Individuals who protect their dopamine baseline by avoiding excessive stimulation and engaging in healthy up-it. Effort-based suits tend to maintain a higher resting level. That means when they do experience a rewarding spike, it feels more profound, lights up. Their motivation circuits are more resilient, more sensitive, and more responsive to progress. Up. There's also a direct between the dopamine system and how effort is perceived. Research has shown that higher dopamine levels in specific areas of the brain, such as the nucleus accumbens, are associated with a greater willingness to exert effort for rewards up. This means that when your baseline is high, effort doesn't feel as difficult. The brain interprets challenges as worthwhile rather than exhausting. This has huge implications for daily productivity and goal setting. Importantly, the spacing between dopamine spikes also matters up. When rewarding events are too frequent and too easy to obtain, they flatten the dopamine system. They decrease contrast up. But when effort precedes reward, when there's time strain or difficulty between spikes, the contrast is higher and the system remains healthy. Up. That contrast is what keeps motivation alive. The brain begins to associate effort with meaning and reward. The ratio of baseline to spike is also why recovery is essential. When people go through intense periods of stimulation, whether through success, social exposure, or intense pleasure, it actually lights up. There's often a subsequent dopamine crash. This isn't burnout in the emotional sense. It's the neurochemical reality of the system needing time to reset up. During this recovery, motivation can feel absent. It's a temporary recalibration of the baseline. Understanding this dynamic allows you to influence your own motivation through behavioral tools. You can preserve your baseline by limiting excessive artificial dopamine spikes. You can improve the system's responsiveness by anchoring reward to effort. You can recognize when a drop in drive is biological, not personal failure. and you can begin to work your brain's natural rhythm of baseline and spikes to shape long-term motivation and resilience in a sustainable way up. Most people assume that the biggest dopamine release occurs when we receive a reward. When we cross the finish line, eat the dessert, get the promotion, it actually lights up or check off the final task on a do list. But neuroscience reveals something quite different up. The largest and most impactful dopamine surges don't occur when the reward is achieved. They happen before it during the phase of anticipation and pursuit. To understand this, it's helpful to look at how the brain predicts value. Dopamine neurons up, especially those in the ventral tegmental area (VTA), and substantia fire not just in response to a reward up, but more robustly when a cue signals the potential for reward. A classic example is found in behavioral experiments with animals. Lights up. If a tone consistently predicts a drop of juice, the dopamine neurons begin to fire in response to the tone itself, not the juice. In other words, up. It's the prediction of reward, not the reward, that activates the dopamine system most intensely. This mechanism serves a crucial biological purpose. Up. Anticipation prepares the organism to act. When dopamine rises in response to a cue, it increases arousal, attention, movement readiness up, and goal-oriented thinking. It shifts the brain into a proactive state. That's not just useful, it's essential up. In order to survive and thrive in a complex environment, organisms must be able to detect patterns, recognize opportunities it actually lights up, and mobilize energy toward future outcomes. The dopamine system is designed to do exactly that up. This also means that the pursuit of a goal is often more neurologically rewarding than the goal itself. Once the reward is achieved up, dopamine levels often return to baseline or even drop slightly below, creating a transient dip that can feel like a mild crash up. This is part of the explanation for why people sometimes feel deflated after achieving something big. The brain's reward system is built for chasing up, not just catching. In practical terms, this means that motivation and excitement are often highest during the planning, preparation, and striving phases up. Think about the days leading up to a vacation, or the build-up to a performance or competition. Dopamine levels are elevated because the brain is projecting into the future, evaluating the potential outcome, and investing resources accordingly. Once the event occurs, dopamine drops back down, and the brain quickly resets to prepare for the next pursuit. From a systems perspective, lights up. This is deeply adaptive. Dopamine acts like a compass, constantly recalibrating based on cues, probabilities, and experiences up. It adjusts your internal state in proportion to your expectations and the likelihood of reward. The greater the uncertainty or challenge, the greater the potential for a strong dopamine signal. This is why unpredictable rewards tend to generate more dopamine than predictable ones. Lights up. The element of surprise magnifies anticipation, making the system more sensitive and more active up. This same dynamic plays out in human behavior across domains. Relationships, learning, sports, entrepreneurship. A student studying for an exam up. A runner training for a race, or an artist preparing for a show. Each experiences a higher dopamine state, not when the goal is completed, up. But as it approaches, the incremental steps, the progress, the visualization of success, these are the neurochemical drivers of motivation, up. There's also a learning mechanism embedded in this process. The dopamine system updates its firing patterns based on outcomes, up. If the reward is better than expected, dopamine spikes. If it's worse than expected, dopamine dips. This is called a reward prediction error. Over time, it actually lights up. This error feedback refines your behavior, sharpening your ability to detect valuable opportunities and discard wasteful ones up. It's a continuous learning loop driven by prediction, experience, and correction. Importantly, an anticipatory system is highly sensitive to context and environment. If your surroundings are rich in cues that suggest progress and potential up, your dopamine system stays active. Visual cues like progress bars, calendars, lights up. Your goal trackers, even the act of writing down plans can signal the brain that something rewarding is on the horizon up. This generates the kind of anticipation that leads to action. The ability to create internal dopamine surges through anticipation is a skill up. People who know how to frame their goals focus on process. It actually lights up, and recognize small wins are better able to keep dopamine levels elevated throughout the pursuit phase up. They're not relying solely on the final outcome for satisfaction. They're wired to engage fully in the journey. This creates resilience. Endurance actually lights up in long-term behavioral consistency across various domains of life and performance up. One of the most powerful discoveries in neuroscience and behavioral psychology is that the brain's dopamine system is not fixed. It's plastic. It can be shaped, redirected, and conditioned over time. This means that the way your brain assigns value to effort, outcome, and experience is malleable. Up. You're not locked into a pattern of only feeling motivation when you get external rewards. Up. You can act. Train your brain to find dopamine release in the process itself. Up. This begins with understanding how dopamine functions as a reinforcing signal. Every time dopamine is released in response to an activity lights up, the brain tags that behavior as important. It learns that the action is worth repeating. Lights up. Most people are conditioned, often from early life, to associate dopamine with the outcome of a tasking, the grade, the prize, the approval, the win up. That creates a neural loop where motivation is tied exclusively to external validation. When those external rewards are absent or delayed, lights up, motivation collapses. But the system doesn't have to work that way, okay? Research shows that you can deliberately associate dopamine with effort, not just outcome. It actually lights up. When you begin to value the exertion, the struggle, the learning, the incremental progress, you engage a different set of pathways up. The brain begins to recognize effort as intrinsically meaningful. Dopamine is released not just when you succeed, but when you push, stretch, and persist up. This is sometimes referred to as effort-based dopamine or dopaminergic reward through process reinforcement. It's a concept seen in high performers across disciplines. Up elite athletes, dedicated researchers, skilled artists up, and resilient entrepreneurs often report feeling most alive during the work itself when they're practicing problem solving or improving up. Their dopamine systems have adapted to reward the pursuit, not just the payoff. Training your brain this way involves intentional cognitive framing up. The way you talk to yourself during a challenging task changes the neurochemical response. For example, actually lights up if you're in the middle of a difficult workout and you focus your internal narrative on how hard it is and how much you wish it were over. Lights up. You're more likely to associate the activity with pain and depletion. Dopamine is suppressed. But if instead lights up, you focus on the effort itself as meaningful, telling yourself up. This discomfort is building something, or every rep is progress. You begin to condition dopamine release during the process up. This concept is not just motivational, it's mechanistic. Dopamine release activates the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia up, both of which are involved in decision-making, action initiation, and goal maintenance. When dopamine is released during effort up, these areas remain more active and engaged. That creates a feedback loop where motivation sustains itself across longer time frames. Lights up, there's a significant interaction between the prefrontal cortex and the ventral striate during this process up. The prefrontal cortex helps you track goals and values, while the ventral stratum is a key part of the reward system up. When you deliberately align your focus with the value of effort, the prefrontal cortex sends signals to the striatum that reinforce the behavior as meaningful, up. Over time, these pathways strengthen. Effort becomes emotionally rewarding, not just logically necessary. This shift also protects you from burnout, up. If your motivation is always dependent on an external reward, your system becomes fragile. The absence of the expected payoff creates a drop in dopamine up, often interpreted as frustration, boredom, or hopelessness. But when your dopamine is tied to effort up, you have access to consistent motivation regardless of outcome variability. You can stay engaged through delays, setbacks, and uncertainty. Up, the ability to find meaning and effort also increases cognitive resilience. People who enjoy the process show greater perseverance, better emotional regulation up, and more flexible thinking in the face of failure. This is partially due to how dopamine interacts with other neuromodulators, lights up, like serotonin and norepinephrine, which regulate mood and alertness. When effort becomes rewarding up, the entire neurochemical landscape shifts toward a more stable and productive state up. This capacity to rewire the dopamine system is supported by a concept called self-directed plasticity. Lights up. It refers to the ability to change based on how you direct your attention, intention, and behavior. It actually lights up when you repeated link positive internal states to moments of effort by reflecting on growth, recognizing progress up, or simply embracing challenge. You strengthen the connection between action and reward up. The nervous system begins to expect dopamine not just at the finish line, but every time you take a meaningful step forward. The dopamine system is highly sensitive to stimulus intensity and frequency. While dopamine itself is a natural molecule the brain uses to drive motivation and reward anticipation lights up, the source of that dopamine release plays a crucial role in determining how the system adapts over time up. When dopamine is in response to artificial stimuli, things that are high reward but low effort, it begins to dysregulate the natural balance of the system up. Over time, this leads to decreased motivation, reduced baseline levels, and a diminished ability to engage with effortful goals. Italy lights up. Artificial dopamine sources include highly palatable foods, fast-paced digital content, pornography, recreational drug use, and even certain forms of gamified social interaction up. These sources trigger rapid and intense dopamine spikes, often far more powerful than those generated by naturally effortful behaviors like working toward a goal. Up, learning a new skill or building something over time. The problem is that these spikes are not paired with meaningful challenge or sustained effort up. So the brain doesn't integrate them in a way that strengthens long-term motivational circuits. From a neurobiological perspective, repeated it actually lights high-amplitude dopamine spikes can lead to a phenomenon called dopamine receptor downregulation up. This is a form of neural adaptation where the brain reduces the number or sensitivity of dopamine receptors in key areas like the nucleus accumbens stratum lights up and prefrontal cortex. These adaptations are an attempt to maintain homeostasis in the face of overstimulation up. The result is a reduction in the impact of future dopamine signals both from artificial and natural sources. As receptor sensitivity decreases up, baseline dopamine levels begin to drop. And because the brain measures dopamine changes relative to baseline, no lights up. Even moderate spikes no longer produce the same effect. Things that used to feel exciting or engaging, like reading a book, going for a run-up, having a conversation, or solving a problem, start to feel dull or effortful. This condition isn't clinical depression, but rather a neurochemical flatness that makes motivation feel out of reach. Importantly, up the duration and frequency of exposure matter just as much as the intensity. Watching short-form content that rapidly shifts attention, for example, up, creates a loop of mini dopamine spikes every few seconds. The brain doesn't have time to process and recover between these bursts over time. This trains the system to expect constant novelty to maintain interest. When faced with tasks that require sustained focus like studying, building actually lights up or working, the brain struggles to engage because it no longer associates steady effort with meaningful dopamine release. The lights up. There's also a behavioral consequence known as the pleasure-pain balance, which is governed by the way the brain and body strive to maintain equilibrium up. When dopamine surges too high from artificial sources, the brain often responds by tipping the balance toward pain or discomfort. This is experienced subjectively as fatigue, restlessness, irritability, or loss of interest. The more frequently this cycle occurs, the more fragile the dopamine system becomes. A real-world example of this can be seen in individuals who compulsively scroll social media or ultra-recessed entertainment for hours lights up in the feels engaging because of the immediate dopamine hits. But in the hours or days that follow up, motivation to do meaningful tasks tends to drop sharply. This isn't a matter of discipline alone, it's neurochemistry up. The system becomes less responsive to natural rewards. In contrast, when dopamine is released through effort-based behavior such as completing a workout, lights up, or writing code, solving a tough problem, or having a deep conversation, it tends to produce a more moderate but sustainable dopamine increase up. These are not overstimulating to the system. Instead, they reinforce circuits that associate effort with reward, strengthening long-term motivation. Recovery is possible, but it requires dopamine resetting up, sometimes referred to in research as a dopamine fast. This doesn't mean eliminating all pleasure. It means temporarily reducing access to high dopamine artificial stimuli so that the baseline can begin to normalize up. During this period, activities that used to feel boring begin to regain their appeal, and the system starts to respond to natural rewards again. Up. Dopamine isn't inherently bad or good, it's about the pattern of release and regulation. When dopamine is earned through intentional action up, the system remains stable and resilient. When it's repeatedly hijacked through artificial means, the system becomes dysregulated, leading to apathy, distraction, and diminished drive lights up.